you guys are getting dragged onto my podcast to talk about all controversial things that I'm sort of not really keen to get dragged into. So I'm effectively interviewing you guys about that today in my stead. So I wanted to start with first, who is Adam Soriak and what the hell is going on with the Labor Party in Victoria? You guys must be kicking yourselves, laughing yourselves silly from New South Wales and Queensland. Just like, look at these guys.
It's important. Sorry, you go, Greg.
No. I need you to start, Jake. You're the knowledge. You've got all the books. I've just got plans, and they're fake.
I've got the guy over the back. He knows all this stuff. I just ask him. Just whisper in my ear, please. Yeah. Okay. All right. So he said, look, it's a bit crazy. So you want to talk about branch stacking? What branch stacking is? What he's been accused of? He's denied it, but essentially branch stacking is when you, effectively falsely inflate the number of people in your party. So in a local branch of your party, you falsely inflate the members in order to essentially become them. So what happened in this case is roughly a quarter of the 16,000 odd members in that party were these fake people, essentially. So they might have been people that Adam Somyurek or people similar to him within his branch, within the apparatchik, that they might have gone out and said, hey, you want to be a member of my cool party? I'll pay for your membership. It'll be great. You'll get a cool tea towel and a flag, and you just put it up on your wall, and you will be great. But I'll vote for you. So I'll take your vote. So I'm gonna pay for your membership, but I'm gonna take your vote, and I'm gonna use that vote in order to get someone elected into my faction of the party. So which he is on the conservative side of the Labor faction or the Labor Party, and he, through this scheme, may have been able to get a hold of a whole bunch of, a block essentially of votes through, essentially people that he was able to get pre-selected. Because in these really safe seats, the margin for pre-selection can be 50 votes. So if you've got 2,000 plus people who you've essentially, fraudulently brought into your party and will actually co-opt their vote, then you can bring in whomever you want.
It seemed pretty crazy, right? Because he'd gotten caught for something similar in the past, and it had come out, and he'd been sort of turfed, I thought, and somehow he weaseled his way back into the party and ended up doing it again with all this backroom plotting, and he is one of the faceless men of the Labor Party, right?
And it does seem that the Labor Party does need to figure out who the faces behind those faceless men are, because you saw Anthony Albanese, the leader of the federal Labor Party.
Good old Albo.
This is the Victorian branch, but you saw him come out this week and say, I couldn't pick this guy. Most of my colleagues couldn't figure out who. Couldn't pick his face out of a lineup.
Yeah. Bullshit.
But he sits on the national executive with Adam Somyurek. So something's wrong there. Anyway,
that's the most annoying part about all of this is everyone's just like, I want to wash my hands of it. I didn't know anything.
Which it makes more sense to say, we got an issue.
Yeah.
I didn't know about it, but I knew this guy and I'm shocked by it.
Yeah, that would have been good to say, especially considering some of his history. I jotted that down just out of pure curiosity. On his Wikipedia page, it mentions that he had a prior conviction for driving while disqualified.
Yeah.
So when he was busted driving, they found out that he had been driving for 12 months without a license, and he got a full-blown conviction. He was accused of allegations of inappropriate behavior in 2015. Yep. An investigation by the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet found that he had bullied his Chief of Staff, Dimity Paul, and he was promoted on several occasions during all of these sort of scandals and all of these sorts of allegations and charges and convictions. And that is just not a good sign. If you don't have checks and balances for those sorts of things in any sort of corporation or any sort of company, I mean, that's just a shocking disregard for decency.
Yeah, well, and the most annoying thing is they seem to point the fingers, right? They'll be like, "Oh, but this is everywhere," and you're like, "That sounds like whataboutery to me." Like,
yeah, and you can only imagine the fun that they would have if this was the Liberal Party. If this was anyone from the Liberal Party, it would just be an absolute shocker, and they would just be having a field day because Scott Morrison's riding high on the polls. Liberal Party's doing pretty well. They're managing things well. They just rose the minimum wage was risen today, which I think it's done by a committee or something.
Yes.
Yeah, but at the same time, people don't know that, and so they'll think it was Scott Morrison. Just thank him for everything. And so it's like, well, gosh, this is not a good look. I'm sure that the Labor Party are very glad that there's not an election around the corner.
Well, it just so happens that there is. The Eden Monaro by-election coming up in only a few weeks.
I forgot That's where Albo's been today. He's been over there working his little butt
right.
off, right?
Yeah, well, he's been up at Thredbo, hasn't he? In New South Wales, isn't Thredbo New South Wales? Sorry,
yep.
Yes, okay,
yep.
It is New South Wales, and so is Eden Monaro.
Yeah, it's all part of it. Yeah. It's all part of it. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's when's that one? When's that? Is that like July 22 or something? Isn't it?
Yeah, it's somewhere around that.
It's in my diary. I'll have to check my diary. So that's who Adam Somyurek is. I can't say it was because I imagine he'll probably get promoted again at some stage because none of this is actually
He's been kicked out of the party.
But none of this is illegal.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was something. Wasn't there a bit of it saying that there was some of the fraud that he was doing carried a potential prison sentence?
Yeah, so, well, he's been referred to Victorian Police and the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission for further investigation.
Yeah,
but whether that will actually form into it. So branch stacking is not illegal, and that's probably
what about branch stacking?
But yes, when you are stacking a branch, branch stacking is not illegal, but committing fraud is illegal.
So he was using taxpayer dollars to pay employees to do the branch stacking.
At this stage we can't definitively say. There are allegations. There were things put forward on the 60 Minutes program that suggested that sort of behaviour. But I mean, personally, I wouldn't be willing to say that's what he did, just because it requires a significant amount more investigation. Not least of it, which is interviewing the police should be interviewing the public servants who were undertaking those calls. Did you know that this was for party purposes? Did you know that this was fraudulent behaviour, et cetera, et cetera? And so anyway, there's more investigation that needs to happen. If fraud occurred, absolutely fair that he'd be charged and appropriately dealt with. But we will just have to see what actually comes of it.
China and Australia. What on earth is going on?
What a segue. Jesus. I knew Gregg was the master of segues.
Yeah, I've just been gagging for it. As soon as this happened today, I was like, I'm in the car with Kel, and we're watching the news, and ScoMo comes out, and he's like,
"How are you watching the news in the car? How does this go?"
We're sitting at the beach. I've got my phone up there. We're eating and having a little,
what's
time
the point of being at the beach?
In the car.
You're at the beach in the car.
You're parked at the beach and you're watching the news.
None of this story is convincing, Pete.
It was 11 degrees. I'm not getting in the water. So anyway, we see that ScoMo has said that there have been ongoing cyber attacks against, what has he said here? He said it was all levels of government, industry, political organizations, education, health, essential service providers and operators of other critical infrastructure. But we're not pointing the finger at anyone.
No.
And then someone came out in the media and was like, one of the senior sources, and like, it's China.
So ABC News reported about an hour or so ago that it was China, and that senior sources within the government had pointed the finger at China. And this is because there's only a handful of countries with state-sponsored cyber actors. That's the term for it.
Well, there's the big three, right? So there's Russia, Iran, and then there's China, really. I mean, not including places like America, which you would probably assume aren't going to be attacking Australia currently.
No, exactly. But yeah, so there has been that determination that it most likely came from China. Only time will tell. It's always unfortunate when you get these concurrent cases of just, we had the we had the origins of COVID, request for an inquest into how that occurred and how it spread. And then Australia raised that, or America raised it. Australia got on board and started leading the charge.
And my dad was like, ScoMo, Jesus, why couldn't you have been the last to put your hand up? We can get on that bandwagon, but why do you need to be the first person to be like, yeah, independent investigation, and piss off our biggest trade partner?
But moreover, it put us in a really awkward position, because when we started seeing, for example, China, we had, consular officials from China that live in Australia. We had journalist sources from China, from state media in China, talking about Australia as, the gum on the shoe of China, guys, we can go anywhere, okay? China saying, we can go anywhere. Why would we come to you? Yeah. You're close. You have good prices. Anything else? Because we can get a good price down the road.
Yeah, but so we have Carm Gillespie as well, who was sentenced to death.
Just this week, yeah.
And that was
after 6 years in jail, right?
I know. Did you hear about this? Like, it was just crazy. Yeah. Like, his friends and his family had no idea where he was. They were trying to track him down for years and years and years. They had just basically presumed that he'd given up and gone AWOL.
Shaved his head, become a religious instructor somewhere.
Exactly, right? I mean, for all we knew, he could be Clive Palmer, right?
Yeah.
In a fat suit.
Right. Watch out! Watch out! Be careful.
You are going to get a suit.
The suit is the thing that's fat. Okay, in that analogy, bad. Right? Now, he could be anyone, right? Could be Ronald McDonald. Is that okay?
Oh, I thought you were about to pull off a mask then. I thought that was that action.
I mean, the list just goes on, right? Like, it just goes on and on and on. And so this guy suddenly appears, and he's got a death sentence awaiting for him. They've appealed it. I don't know what's come of the appeal. I think he had like 2 days or something to appeal the thing.
He had 48 hours to.
Yeah, but like,
act fast.
Let's be clear. So he was on drug charges. He brought a bunch of a drug into China, which is a
silly move.
It's a charge that carries the death penalty. And there was an Australian just a few years ago who was sentenced to death for the same thing, and he's since had his death commuted to a life sentence. So look, the thing is, it's not so strange for China is not necessarily susceptible to international pressure. So if Carm Gillespie is over there and he's accused of this thing, and his lawyer says, you can either go public and try for public outcry, or you can't and you'll get the same result. Why wouldn't you act to just keep the situation on the down low? So I understand a little bit of that. It's just the timing of things. You're absolutely right, Greg. It's all of these things coming through at the same time. Even this week, there was discussion around whether iron ore imports into China from Australia are going to be affected as well. And there was speculation based on that, which affected the iron ore price. So, yeah, this stuff is really heating up. And it all seems to stem from the fact that we decided that we would be the ones leading the charge instead of any other bloody country.
But you know what? Like, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm sure there are people not okay with it, but I'm kind of okay with it, right? I actually appreciate the fact that
this guy getting the death penalty. No, I'm not okay with that. What I'm okay with is the fact that that Scott Morrison had the cojones to go ahead and actually do something about it. Like he's brought it to the conversation. Like, he's sort of like, it's almost as if he's just done the right thing. Even though it was difficult, even though it was a challenge, he's done the right thing.
And China's not mentioned in the report, by the way, in the proposal for the investigation.
Yes.
So they're just behaving they're behaving worse than some of the students I teach.
On The Voice, I agree. Yeah.
It's just anyway. They're just being so immature about this whole situation. Get your act together. Go to your room, China. I don't know. It just seems so like from the outside looking in. I've got no opinion. I've just got no knowledge about where to go from here. What diplomatic situation will occur with Australia and China. But I do know what's happening from a news perspective and from a person who doesn't deal with trade very often. To be frank, I like some of the options that maybe there's the UK trade deal that was announced today. Is that sort of opening the doors to some other options?
Well, that's just the announcement that we are looking to have a free trade deal with the UK, and that was coming anyway because the UK left the EU in January, I think it was. So we are essentially, Australia is renegotiating all of the terms that we previously had with the UK under the EU agreement. We're now negotiating directly with the UK. Could it make up for the stuff that we stand to lose from China? No. They're
the UK
1.34
doesn't buy that much.
Yeah, China's 1.34 billion, and the UK is about 200 million. So, sure, we can probably pick up some trade from the UK. Tim Tams, I think Boris Johnson highlighted, Tim Tams and Vegemite, and we get in return Marmite and penguins.
Yeah.
It's like keep it.
Keep it. Controversial.
Yeah, it's a real challenge.
Free trade, not fair trade.
It is scary. I think, and there's a couple of other little stories which have crept up as well. There's the story of Drew Pavlo. Is it? I don't want to get his name wrong. He's a member of the University of Queensland. And he was elected to their Senate, and essentially he started to protest being pro-Hong Kong and democratic Hong Kong rights. And they've come down on him like a ton of bricks. I mean, according to Drew anyway, they've come down on him like a ton of bricks. Apparently, there's a lot of investors for the University of Queensland, and they have just annihilated him. They've stripped him of his position. They've charged him with all these things. He's got a high-profile, I forget his name, he's got a high-profile lawyer working for him, like a human rights lawyer working for him. He's really had to fight for his position. He's fighting for being dismissed unlawfully.
Also fighting for his right to party.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest thing out of all of this. There's also, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that story anymore. We contacted Drew for an interview, and he said he's a little tied up at the moment. We said, yes, that's more than reasonable.
Unfortunately, yeah.
There's also Daniel Andrews, and a lot of people accusing him of being that's the Victorian Premier, being very closely tied to China and sort of being wooed over the years and being beholden to their beholds. And, there's all sorts of little stories that crop up, and I think that's where I'm going, right? Like, kudos to Scott Morrison for bringing some of these conversations out.
I get that, yeah. But I almost think that in general. But I almost think that Scott Morrison was, I would say, tricked into having a position on this.
Yeah.
Because we had, the first people...
Gave him a piece of chocolate or something?
No, I think, the first people to speak about, Australia... advocating for an inquiry into COVID's origins and its proliferation across the world. The first ones to raise it in Australia were backbench Liberal MPs and senators. And the backbenchers are the opinionated people who don't have portfolios, who don't have to hold their tongues, etc. And they were the ones not necessarily saying Australia should take the lead on this. They said everything that Trump said we should do. And we get behind Trump and we should absolutely advocate for this. And I feel that Scott Morrison maybe may not have had an opinion whatsoever about this unless I don't think that Scott Morrison would have had anything to say on this particular topic except for, bad thing, need to get to the bottom of it, need an inquiry, World Health Assembly is coming up, let's, talk about it there.
Yeah, right.
That it might have been, completely diplomatic. I just feel as though he was pushed to have a position on it because his backbenchers, spoke, I wouldn't say necessarily out of turn, but spoke out of turn, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Not
what do you
good.
think Australia's going to have
Nothing's
to do in the near future in order to sort of protect itself from being too
Diversify.
reliant? Yeah, diversify.
I mean, you got two options.
Hemp.
You
I'm all
kowtow
for the
or-
hemp. No one's told me why we can't do hemp.
Yeah.
Well,
Whole new industry, lots of jobs, lots of export. Done.
starting in the New South Wales north coast, up in the hills. Lots of
That's
hemp,
not so much
no
hemp.
vaccine.
It's yeah,
Horrible
anyway.
for rope and for clothes.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're using the rope and the clothes for, really.
That's a great point. It is a great point. Look, diversify. We've got two options, really. It's diversify or kowtow, and it's too late to kowtow. So we don't really have that option there anymore.
How interesting is it going to be if China, if this interaction with China pushes us away from exports of things like coal and iron ore and further towards renewable energy and dealing with climate change as a result because we have no other position?
I mean, it would be slightly ironic if Australia, developed a national push to green energy industry, industrialization, because we've lost our ability to, essentially trade on the things that we love to dig up and sell. That we have to, create essentially a industry sector in order to replace the mining sector, or move the stuff that we're digging out of the ground into manufacturing, great big towers that hold great big fans that, blow around or et cetera, et cetera. So, it would be interesting.
Segue there. How on earth did Rio Tinto manage to blow up a 46,000-year-old Indigenous sacred site without knowing?
They said
Can
sorry.
we talk about that?
They apologised. All's good.
They did apologise. They did apologise, and they've tried to do some recompense.
Then wasn't there some recording or something released this week?
I was going to say that Rio Tinto actually funded a documentary, I think 2 to 4 years prior, that featured that site they blew up. It's a mining company doing what mining companies do, which is they dig up the ground so that they can get to the stuff underneath. And it just so happened that somebody, went and put a sacred site right where there was a
46,000 years ago.
46,000-year-old rock shelter.
Right where there was a valuable piece of iron ore. So it's bad, and there's a whole range of these ancient structures or significant culturally significant places dotted all around Western Australia and elsewhere around Australia that the miners have access to, and within the Rio Tinto space, within the Pilbara region, Rio Tinto have already put in applications to go ahead and mine a whole bunch of areas that fall within these culturally significant boundaries.
Yeah, and it says here that in response, Mr. Salisbury went through the events leading up to the gorge blast and said that was why Rio Tinto hasn't, quote, apologised for the event itself per se, but apologised for the distress the event caused. So they don't really feel... I don't think they feel the right sort of sorry that everyone was hoping that they would.
Sorry we got caught. Yeah.
Yeah. But they did move to clarify Rio's position on Monday, saying the company unreservedly apologises for what happened at Jukan?
Yes, good try. I don't know.
That's not bad. We suddenly realised that we're actually a lot more sorry than we initially were.
Yeah, right on Monday.
And do you think that this event has kind of obviously happened at the the wrong time for Rio Tinto, right?
Yeah,
Where there's sort of like the mass outcry. We've got Black Lives Matter in the US that's bled over into Australia. Indigenous issues are at the forefront in the news at the moment. And Rio Tinto, I don't know if they did that during Black Lives, the stuff
Just
with George
immediately
Floyd.
prior.
But just prior, yeah, exactly. So do you think that there's going to be, do you think the government's going to be forced to step in now and just be like, look, we're going to have to do something about this. We can't just have this keep going on because people are going to rage up and we're not going to save our seats.
Look, I think the most unfortunate, it was announced during, which week was it? Is it Sorry Week? Sorry Day?
I think so. I think Reconciliation Week.
Reconciliation Week, thank you. Yes. So it was announced during Reconciliation Week, which was immediately prior to the George Floyd killings. Look, I think if the government is going to do anything, it should be to say, hey, guys, you need to reevaluate this. Where you're about to mine, you need to reevaluate your impact on culturally significant, areas, particularly of
can't you just blow up all around the interesting bits, like just around them, just instead of everything, just leave the good bits and you can have the soil under the boring bits.
What about wasn't there there's another, I don't know if it was Rio Tinto, but another group this week announced that they were going to be sort of destroying a whole bunch of other archaeologically significant sites from Indigenous people. And there's been protests in the streets about that, announcing it this week. And I think they might have reneged that. I don't remember who it is, but there's certainly, something's happening there. And it's so weird that they're sort of announcing it right now and that they're even considering it. And I just think, gosh, the theme here, from my perspective, is that you can get too big. You can get too big. You can get to a point where you can just sort of walk all over the little person and you can't be pulled into line because too many people are relying on you and people and the big person knows that they have too many people relying on them. Yeah.
Well, this tends to be the case, though, with these mining companies, right? Because they're sort of like, well, we lobby for you guys to be voted in. We give a massive number of jobs. We have all these tax dollars that go to the government, whilst we also make billions of dollars ourselves. So it's very difficult for the government to say no.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Plus jobs and also, like one of the more powerful images I saw this week, which did make me, take pause, was the image of the Captain Cook statue, which was being well protected by, half a
Plastic
dozen
bags.
horses or something, half a dozen horses and police officers on horseback. Meanwhile, places like the Indigenous, heritage places, the significant places, are being destroyed and sort of, just get to have an apology. Meanwhile, the Captain Cook statue is protected. It's being very well...
Only because it's right there, right? The cops had to just leave the shop and go around the corner,
Yeah, well, but I suppose that's sort of... That's the point, right? Like, the point is that the further west you go, the further, away from the cities you go, the less significant you become, the less significant your past becomes, and the less significant your history, your historical elements become,
It is an interesting thing, and I think the position you hold, Greg, is perfectly reasonable. I think...
It is.
Personally, it is. I agree. I think I don't personally really care if a culturally significant place is demolished if the native title holders are okay with it. And the other side of that is a very large multinational company going to see the native title owners saying, hey, we want to blow up this thing, may impact on your cultural heritage, but we're going to do it anyway. And here's, by the way, $100,000, and here's a piece of paper that you signed to say you're okay with it. So these are mutually exclusive positions that are that probably exist today, in that many people would probably be okay with cultural history being preserved as much as possible, but potentially in museum, if the native title owners were okay with it. But there is probably a good chance that if that was if that was allowed under common law, etc., or native title law, that you would have large mining companies or similar companies exploiting their size and wealth to, essentially muscle in and push people to make decisions that they don't necessarily want to make. I don't know.
There is a lot of stuff there that I want to ask you about, but I thought maybe we can start with BLM and then get towards the Indigenous stuff in Australia and what's been going on. Do you want to sort of give a quick recap of what's happened? I had a lot of people ask me, Pete, do a podcast on Black Lives Matter, and I was thinking, do you want me to never podcast again? Like, I'm gonna be like ruined if I talk about this topic, not being someone who is of African American descent. But yeah. I thought I would throw you two under the bus instead. So, can you give us a recap and your views on the Black Lives Matter movement in the US?
I'll specifically on the US.
Well, we can talk about after you sort of give a review. We can talk about it bleeding into Australia and the Indigenous issues here.
Mine's pretty simple. Look, I mean, it's if you look at statistics, if you look at the what's happening with black people in America, it's pretty obvious that why people are angry, and I think you need to be angry about those sorts of things if that's how you feel. But what's not good is rioting or spray painting your things over police departments and declaring Chaz. That's my new favorite thing.
Can you tell us what that stands for, by the way, and what it is? Chaz?
Yes, it is the what was Chaz? It was the something. What is it? Zone. It is the Chaz stands for. Come on.
It's something autonomous zone.
Yeah, the autonomous zone. What is it? Inside Chaz, Seattle's little autonomous zone.
The Capitol Hill organized protest, that's CHOP. And then you've got Capitol Hill CHOP. Autonomous Zone.
That's it, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. They have basically set up a zone where they basically said we don't want police here. We want to be able to the money needs to be diverted to more welfare programs, and that's what we want. Now the police in Seattle decided that was maybe not reasonable, but they decided to back down so that there was significant less risk of violence and aggression occurring. So kudos to them for backing down. These people have set up this autonomous zone, and I've read on the internet about the things that they've requested involve things like, vegan, produce and all sorts of things they need. Yeah, all that sort of stuff, right? So, I mean, look, there's a fair bit of belief that it's really not going to go anywhere similar to the sort of the Occupy Wall Street movement, that sort of thing. Who knows? Maybe they'll actually get some change. I know that there's some changes to the to policies and things that are happening in the United States. They seem a little bit tokenistic, but at least it's change. Well,
even Trump said something, right, where he's trying to bring in something where if police have to deal with homeless or people with mental health issues, they have to have social workers there with them. I think he's wanting to give them more training as well.
Yeah, well,
Which
I haven't.
Is wholly appropriate.
Well,
yeah, I mean, look, this is the thing. They're not really demanding. I mean, some of them are demanding pretty insane things, but a lot of them aren't demanding insane things. And a lot of people are just demanding, similar to what we were talking about before, this idea that there's people in corporations who are just too big, they have too much power, they get away with too many things, and they just eat the little people. And that's going to create anger. I don't think that something like Chaz or rioting. I mean, look, even this situation that happened at Wendy's the other day, and then all of a sudden the rioters are burning down the Wendy's. Like, don't burn down the Wendy's. Like, we understand that you're angry, and you should be angry, and you should be out there in the streets, and you should be protesting in a very legitimate way. But if you're trying to, and ultimately you are trying to win a political argument, you're trying to win over hearts and minds for your case, you are not going to win over the people who disagree with you if you go around burning down Wendy's and start rioting and smashing things and trying to use it as an excuse to get a free television. You're not going to win over hearts and minds because they have the same problem over there as what we the same perceived problem over there as what our perceived problem was, which is the silent majority, right? These people who are maybe right-wing, who vote for Trump because they don't want to vote for Biden, and they're the ones, they don't really have a voice. You don't really have, you got Fox News and stuff, obviously, but like they're a bit whacked out too. You don't have this sort of level-headed right-wingness, which does exist. You got to dig for it. But those people you can't go to a dinner party and say, well, I'm voting for Trump. The dinner party's dead. So you can't do that. You can't. They'll be building an army of people against them if they continue to do these insane, really extreme acts of violence.
Well, that's the biggest problem, right? So you've got Black Lives Matter, which is a movement from my understanding that's come forward after there have been a series of violent killings by police of black people in America, and they just want justice. They're trying to reduce the amount of violence from police brutality, and
Yes.
they're fighting for equality and equity for the African American population. The issue is that at least at the moment, it's being hijacked by a lot of other groups, like, I think even Antifa is reported of getting involved and trying to spread a bit of violence. There's groups that are obviously like, well, there's lots of people on the street, so now we can go and riot, and we'll just hide under the guise of being part of the protest.
Sure.
And so, the problem is that they don't really have strong leadership in terms of the movement Black Lives Matter, right? It's kind of a snake with many heads.
Well, so many things to unpack there. I think probably firstly it's important to recognise that the premise of Black Lives Matter is a statement being made by people who want to assert that their lives also matter.
And why is all lives matter so offensive, Jake, to Black Lives Matter members or those supporters?
I probably can't talk to that because I don't fully understand the motive behind people who just want to change the message. But what I would say is Black Lives Matter is an all-inclusive term. It's not saying all lives don't matter and only Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
It's not saying that Black Lives Matter to the exclusion of all other lives. It's saying Black Lives Matter and we don't all start from the same position of privilege. So let's state it for the record once and for all, Black Lives Matter. Okay. Now let's do something about the fact that Black lives do matter, and let's try to bring us all up to that same level playing field. So as a statement, it's a perfect statement that, and sort of moving into the protest space, protesters angry at the fact that people are being killed by police officers, and it seems to be overwhelmingly, statistically significantly, black men being killed by police officers. Sure, plenty of other people being killed by police officers. Also seems to be a hell of a lot of black men.
Did you listen to the Sam Harris podcast that I sent you guys about this topic?
I'm not one to ever listen to Sam Harris about anything.
You jumped off the bandwagon, did you?
I'm pretty sure I started off the bandwagon. But I was never on the. I just can't stand his voice. It's a weird cadence. I can't enjoy it. It feels like I'm reading a textbook on cell biology.
It's 2 times speed, mate. That fixes everything.
No. I listen to everything on 2 times speed, and I still want to go to sleep. But yeah, it's the whole premise that these protests have occurred out of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is a moot point. The fact is, a whole lot of people have said no more of that, and they are using the premise of Black Lives Matter to hold these protests. So the fact that there is not necessarily great leadership points to the fact that there are just a whole bunch of people, individuals, who want to stand up for this premise. Just one more point, because I can hear you inhaling every time I finish the sentence.
Welcome to my world, Pete.
A protest is a protest until it's no longer a protest. So totally in support of people, protesting whatever pick your topic. I absolutely also think that this particular topic is, the Australian context, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody is a very important subject, and one that needs to be front and centre, because their lives matter absolutely as well. But the second that it goes into rioting, that's not a protest anymore, and it's no use referring to it as protest anymore, because they're not.
That's the sort of aspect of it that really shits me, is because it seems like, especially with the rioting, which community is being the most affected by the rioting, right? It tends to be the black community. I mean, there was a story of, I've forgotten his name, I'll see if I can look it up quickly, but a 76-year-old retired police officer who was protecting a store from rioters, and they just killed him. And it just didn't make the news. So I guess it goes to bigger things too, in terms of the media's role in this as well. And I mean, from listening to Sam Harris's podcast,
how good is Sam Harris?
He goes through all the statistics.
How good a ticket?
He goes through all the statistics and tries to talk about that, that there are a lot of there are 10 million arrests every single year in the US, and there's 1,000 deaths by cops. And how many of these are going to be videoed now, into the future? And one of his sort of pleas from that podcast is there's always going to be another black person who gets killed by the cops and is videoed now. There's going to be white people, there's going to be Hispanics, it's going to be something that keeps coming up again and again and again. And we need to talk more about, obviously the individual issues, but we can't have it turn into a one race versus the other every single time this seems to take place. So what do you think? What can be done in terms of... Is
it one race against the other?
Well, when I say that, I mean to reduce it to race automatically. So, for instance, there was I've forgotten his name again too, but there was a white guy who was killed recently by another group of cops who were all white. And they did effectively, it was the George Floyd thing. They knelt on his back. He had schizophrenia. He couldn't breathe. They were making jokes about the fact that he was passing out. He dies underneath them. And they were making jokes like, well, I hope I didn't kill him, as they're putting him into the ambulance. And you can see how pissed the ambulance officers are, because they're like, the guy's dead. You've killed the guy. But when you break it down, you realize that these cops didn't do it obviously based on race, because they're all the same race, but also they would have used that same technique on probably hundreds of other suspects in terms of holding them down and pinning them. But for whatever reason, the health issues of this, one individual person, it's caused him to die. But if that had been a black person, it would have been all over the news. It would have been a completely different story, even if racism had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Even if it was the same circumstances. And so Sam Harris's point was, we can't have this kind of thing become a volatile, explosive thing across the entire country when these situations happen. And there doesn't, from his point of view, and I'm still yet to be sold on it, it doesn't seem like these individual killings, although horrendous, and these people should face, court or whatever to investigate whether it was murder or manslaughter or whatever. There still needs to be quite a bit of digging done, and burden of proof is on the people saying that it is just racism that's leading to this, because we do know that there are loads of people killed by cops of the same race, of different races. It seems to be that race doesn't necessarily explain when and why people are killed by the cops. So yeah, that's sort of my position on it. I'm still yet to be sold in terms of racism for those sorts of things. Sure, there's structural racism in the US, but at least in America is such a different animal too, because they have 300 million guns, going around. It's a very, very, very different place to be a police officer. And the weird thing that sort of annoys me is that we know that the police officers in the US are obviously really poorly trained, really poorly equipped to deal with a lot of these situations. And people want to abolish the police who are serving, how many other people in the same community. And it should be the complete opposite, right? It should be, no, let's invest more money. Let's make this a better job, a respected job, a more well-trained job where these people know how to interact with the members of the community. Let's train up people from within the communities that they're actually going to police, right? Because you can imagine, especially in African American communities, if you can take people from that community and make them the police, and it was the same issue here in Australia, and have them policing themselves effectively, you're going to have much less violent interactions like this, and probably a lot better outcomes and less crime and everything like that. There was a good story in Australia where they made some Indigenous people cops and moved them into an Indigenous community, and crime plummeted straight after that had happened, because they understood how to interact with the people so that things didn't just, turn into a massive explosion each time. So I don't know. That's kind of my 2 cents on it. But I feel like it's it's not helpful to just say a white cop or a group of cops, because the other guys with George Floyd weren't white, so there were some Hispanics there as well. It feels like a blunt instrument to just say the reason that guy died was racism. And it's like, there's so many other explanations. The cop could have been a moron. He could have been power hungry. He could have just been violent. He could have been racist.
Could have been all of those things.
Exactly. Could be a mix of all of them. But I don't like the jump straight to, it's definitely racist. All cops are racist. Kill cops. Abolish the cops across the entire country. And then that comes to Australia, and it's like, we need to also get rid of cops. All cops are racist. It's like, whoa. Wind it back. Let's investigate it a bit more.
Yeah, I really think you've hit a few nails on the head there. I really think that the idea of, on the one hand, the protests could have gone like very much, the protests sort of, like you said, a snake with many heads, right? Not that I think they're snakes, but it's a good metaphor. And we sort of had a similar situation here where people were protesting, but maybe not sure why. They were just angry about, their own individual thing, right? I think out of the conversations, right, even this conversation that we're having now, the things that I've seen drop out of it is that, okay, there is something going on, particularly with Indigenous or Black communities in America, where there is a sense of over-policing, right? Like if I go out and do something here as a white male where I live, I'm less likely to be pulled over. I'm less likely to be policed. If I leave town, I'm less likely to be pulled over or something like that. There are full-blown communities here in Australia which are just well and truly over-policed. So if you do these things which, usually a rich white person could do, and maybe have a police officer go, oh, that's a bit naughty, you go the other way. If you're an Indigenous Australian in a particular environment, right? Like there is this sense of over-policing. So something about the culture needs to change. Not the Indigenous culture. Something about the policing culture needs to change. Something about the way that police interact with the communities. Beautiful stories about people interacting with the community and winning those hearts and minds. The way that they approach people when they are arrested. I know that I think it was Australia, we banned chokeholds, and I was like, that seems like a pretty good idea. As a method for dealing with people. Surely there's other options.
For me, on that point, as someone who does jiu-jitsu, my advice would be learn how to use the chokeholds correctly. Like it should be more that they should be trained properly. If you're holding someone in a choke for 8 minutes, you fucked up.
Yeah, you've done something wrong. Oh, look, the other.
Sorry, Greg. I just want to point out we probably also need to give training to the public on when to tap out as well. That's implicit in your description there. Sorry.
No, I think that was quite a comical point. Putting the onus back on.
As a sort of point there that Sam Harris was talking about in his podcast, and I won't put it in his tone, but he was saying we need to also respect that you need to be prepared for how to interact with police, whether you're right, whether you're wrong. The time to complain to a police officer is not while he's trying to arrest you. It's after the fact, when you're at the police station. Then you can go to town telling him you're going to take his job, everything like that. But even if you're innocent and he's in the middle of trying to arrest you and you resist and say, no, F you, I'm innocent, you're not taking me down. It's kind of like he's got deadly force. He has deadly force that he can use, even if he's turns out to be wrong, and he may use that on you.
But I guess the question is, who has to have that conversation? Like I don't have to have that conversation. You know what I mean?
I think plenty of people do. I think that's beyond race. I'm sure there are plenty of you couldn't say that resisting arrest is a racial thing. I think there are plenty of people who resist arrest. Whatever your race is, don't resist arrest. You need to have that. You need to complain later. Don't complain in the moment. Obviously, there is issues of institutionalized racism where people are going to think that they're being unfairly targeted, which may be the case, but the time to work that out is later, not in the moment. Because how often are you going to convince a cop, by complaining or saying, actually I'm innocent, and he'll be like, you know what, I changed my mind, you can go.
That's fair enough. I suppose my point is I've never even thought about having that conversation. Like even with the kids that we've got, and there's like 50,000 of them or something. I've never, like, we've talked about a lot of things, and we've had a lot of conversations about the conversations that we should be having. And I don't think ever once we've talked about, we need to talk to the 13-year-old about what to do if they're ever arrested or approached by the police. I suppose because I don't really know either. Like, I've had some horrific interactions with the police, but I haven't resisted. I've been a little bit of a smart aleck, but I haven't resisted any sort of, and I really have. Like, they've really come out, with their chest puffed, and I've just sort of laughed it off. But that's me, right? And I don't know. That would be uncommon. Like, this was in a small town where there's obviously a lot more, there's a lot more police per person, right? So the odds are but since I've lived in New South Wales, nothing. Like, I've been pulled over once for an RBT, and my interactions are pleasant, and off I drive. But when I lived in a small country town, man, it was on. I do think that the proactivity is something that needs to change. A more proactive approach towards building resentment for generations. I mean, look at this situation with Rio Tinto. That builds resentment for generation. Like, it really does. You don't get to say sorry about that on Wednesday, found out that you're not sorry about it on Monday, and then re-apologize, and all is well in the world. Like, you don't get to do any of that, and all of these things have consequences. It's never ending. I think I agree in the sense that there are lots of conversations that we're having that need to transcend the racial concerns as well. And I also think I'm not too fussed on the statue situation. I don't really. Well, we can get to that, but what are the issues? How did the Black Lives Matter thing move into Australia, and how has it manifested itself? I had a few questions about that. Can we talk about Indigenous deaths in custody in Australia?
There's been 30 years ago, Australia held an inquest, a royal inquest into a royal commission, into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and we're all going to pretend that Gregg's still there and not just hanging out in the dark.
His camera's turned off, guys, just for reference.
And out of that, there were a whole series of recommendations, of which I think less than a third were actually implemented. Now, since then, the Guardian Australia have been keeping track of Aboriginal deaths in custody. That is, people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who die or are killed or commit suicide while in custody or while in jail. And that number, I believe it has increased recently, but the most recent number that I'm aware of is 432.
Yeah.
That was a number that we saw on the placards of people right across Australia at protests that were being held. And they were, holding up placards saying 432, when are we going to, get our stuff together? When are we going to have, Aboriginal deaths in custody or Aboriginal incarceration as one of the Close the Gap items in the Close the Gap report that is reported on every year? When are we going to start addressing this? One of the most, impactful cases in recent years was, I think, in 2016, David Dungay Jr., who was in a prison, was unwell, and very unfortunately, and very similar and graphic audio was subjected to somewhat similar circumstances to George Floyd, in that he had a prolonged death as a result of police officer, or rather prison officers that were, trying to restrain him, and he died as a consequence. And the inquest was not favourable towards, indicting or taking action against the prison guards who were responsible for his health and safety during his incarceration. So the Black Lives Matter protests that were held 2 weeks ago and then again last weekend were quite large, particularly in Australia's capital cities. They were both Black Lives Matter protests in solidarity with those occurring in the United States of America. As you know, certainly around the world there were similar such protests, but they were also we do have our own shame, I suppose. We do have our own take on deaths in custody related to our Indigenous populations.
We've got, it's sort of a similar story, right, to the US with African American men being overrepresented in the prison population. I think it's like 6% African Americans. 6% of the population is African American males, and 37% of the prison population is African American. And in Australia, it's a similar thing where we have 3% of the population is Indigenous, and almost 30% of the prison population is Indigenous. And it tends to be from pretty dumb stuff, right? In terms of reasons to put people in jail, not paying your parking fines, or there were a whole bunch of these laws that have been passed in some of these communities where people end up in jail for pretty trivial things, right? Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Fines. Well, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of information, but certainly I've heard very similar stories. Yeah, there are all sorts of reasonably archaic laws that seem to have been put in place specifically to impact the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living in those communities. And you sort of referenced one there where somebody might be incarcerated for a significant amount of time for the simple crime of jaywalking a bunch of times and being caught doing so. And because they have a bunch of these fines for a similar offence and they have never paid it, then they are, sentenced to a prison term. And this is related. What occurs in individual circumstances, you can't necessarily apply to, all circumstances. We don't know what happens in each of those individual circumstances that might lead to the incarceration of that individual. We're not sure whether it is whether it is institutionalized racism that drives, a guilty finding over an innocent one for, anybody else. We don't know whether it is, resistance and, belligerence in the court.
Well, and that's the thing that frustrates me the most. It seems like the media and the public look for disparities and then immediately assign it to things like institutionalized racism. And although it very, very well may be the case that it is institutionalized racism, as someone with a scientific background, that kind of sends alarm bells, screaming in my ears when anyone just automatically determines what the reason is without some sort of deeper investigation into what's going on. Because I feel like if you don't look into things properly and you don't try and have a more nuanced approach and get to the bottom of things, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. You might be able to blame people and feel better in the moment, but you won't actually get to why do we have more Indigenous people per capita or like per population percentage in jail in Australia than they should be, and how do we reduce that if we just assume what the thing is and then go after that as if it's the answer.
I mean, on the face of it though, you just look at those statistics of percentages incarcerated between white and Indigenous or white and Indigenous Australians, and you can infer from that there is something driving the incarceration rate of Indigenous Australians, and whether that is institutionalized racism. I mean, on the face of it, that would be immediately where I go.
Yeah.
When you see such a high percentage of Indigenous Australians incarcerated compared to the non-Indigenous Australian population, you can out of you can infer out of that it is something structural as opposed to non-structural. Simply because of that.
Would you do that based on gender?
I think we
don't
do.
know. I don't know.
Sorry?
I think we do.
Well, what do you think the proportion of men and women in jail is?
Significantly higher.
I suppose.
Men,
Well, I mean, I don't know as an Australian population. I'm guessing that you do from your cheek.
I looked it up.
But at the same time, even if it was a trick question, right? And there were more women in jail than men, right? At the same time,
we'd know about it, Greg.
I think you can use this data well. And you can use this data to say, hey, this particular program or whatever we're doing is working. This particular program or whatever we're doing in this particular area is not working. I'm not one necessarily to be in favor of divisions down and down and down and down and down. But data's data, and we can do that, I suppose, to some extent with this sort of data. And I think it can be beneficial. I think it can pinpoint where things aren't going right. And we've made changes in the past based on that particular data. I wanted to go back just quickly to your point about jumping to conclusions. I think on the podcast, and this is an opinion I'm comfortable with. We had an Indigenous boy who was targeted by a police officer, and he slipped his legs out from underneath him, and he went down onto the ground. Now, everyone was sort of disgruntled by this, and I think you should be, right? You should be asking questions, but the point is, it doesn't matter what you think about whether or not this police officer needs to be in jail, or whether or not he did the right thing. It doesn't matter, in the sense that you should have an opinion and you should express that freely with your friends, and you should be able to say it on a podcast, and you should be able to say it whatever. But it doesn't really matter. It's not good to walk around saying something like he's guilty, because that undermines the very fabric of our wonderful society, which, and I've said it again, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again, those beautiful 6 words, innocent until proven guilty. And if you are, these days, throughout history, right? If you're trialed, what do they call it? The public trial, trial by opinion, you've lost that. We saw that with a little bit of the Me Too movement. I'm not saying it was a bad movement, but there was some of that in there as well. That there's this idea that, well, if he's found to be not guilty, that the entire system's corrupt. And that might not be the case. So you really undermine the trust in the system. And I think there's legitimate reasons to do that and illegitimate reasons to do that. But ultimately, if the court of public opinion, that's it, jumps to the conclusion that this man was guilty, we end up with all sorts of public pressures to make the wrong decision, influences to make the wrong decisions. So it doesn't really matter what I think. Living here and doing this, I'm not in charge of the investigation. It doesn't really matter.
I guess the thing underlining that, though, is your faith in the system. And I would imagine that Indigenous people in Australia and probably African Americans in America just have zero faith in it. So they think even if it is, 100%.
I don't think that's unique to people of colour or otherwise, though. I know plenty of, my neighbours and friends who also have a general mistrust of not just police, but of people in authority.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I mean, it's not
definitely.
like...
we see them on TV all the time, and they
stories,
seem to be more.
5G, no 5G.
It's stories on the news that we've seen this week that work to undermine that system, all this stuff with the with Labor and all that sort of stuff, we constantly are on the lookout for things that will undermine the system, and no system is perfect, but when you break down the type of society that most Australians live in, that most Australians are very well off compared to the rest of the world, that most Australians would be considered immensely rich compared to most of the rest of the world, that we have democratic elections, that we have freedom of speech, and all of these things are, you can argue the nuances, but a lot of the proof is in the pudding. I mean, look at our healthcare systems and our social security systems and our all of these systems that other countries don't even have. I mean, the discussions that you hear some Americans have about healthcare and the bills that some of the health that they've received for their COVID care when I was able to just drive literally 20 minutes down the road, get a free test, off we came home, we got a text message saying it was all good. Not a lick of difference. I can go to the doctor, not be a cent out of pocket. I can go to the chemist, and whatever drug cost me, $7 or something that was going to otherwise cost me $60. Like, all of these things that the education system, all of these things. And yes, there's flaws in all of these, and yes, they need improvement. But overall, we don't live in some tyrannical, beast of a society. That's an offense to people who actually live in those sorts of areas.
The issue there is, I think, that people...
There's no issue there. That's a perfect opinion. It was a perfect phone call. That's a perfect opinion.
I'm trying to think of how to word it, though. But I think people gauge the environment that they live in, and they don't have, reference to things like the Second World War or to when smallpox was rampant, at least today. And so when bad things do happen, that's the worst, the worst things that happen in their day-to-day life are still the worst things that happen in their day-to-day life, right?
I can see
so
that.
It's weird, like it's almost like the brackets have just like closed in, and really, the worst things that do happen in reference to people who lived hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago are pretty trivial, but people still treat them the same way. They still have the same reaction, that it's like, I have this sort of argument with some of my friends who are very, very feminist, and the way that they talk about feminism and women's issues, which a lot of which are still sort of valid, it's as if it's never been worse. And you're kind of like, you've woken up and you have the vote, you have, contraception, you have all these things that have sort of women have fought for hundreds of years, but you don't realize that, because you've only grown up in the environment that you've got. But at the same time, you sort of have to appreciate the fact that it's not as bad as it's ever been, just because there are still things to improve.
Previous generations have, concessions have been made. They have gotten the vote because of the action that they've taken. They have gotten access to contraception because of the action of that generation. But now they're just smashing away at this glass ceiling, and nothing is changing. So I do kind of get the frustration. In that, they're not able to get the meaningful change that their previous generations, that their foremothers have fought for.
Yeah, I would say that's.
They are asking for different stuff.
Look, I think from a wider sort of moral, I don't know, like a moral standpoint, I guess. It's there needs to be some sort of cutoff. I think I guess I worry about some sort of backlash for being proud about some things. Like, I worry if I say, we've got, if I list off these things, like we've got fantastic healthcare, we've got a fantastic education system, we've got all this sort of stuff, that I'm not allowed to feel proud about that because there's others people who don't have that. And I don't know, is that right? Should I be like, well, that's great, but I'm not, I'm not satisfied with all of that because I need to keep...
This seems to be a deep issue, right, with Western culture today, because it's like, again, we're focusing on all the negative sides which exist and need to be dealt with, but we completely forget all of the positive stuff that we have to offer the world, to offer ourselves, that we've, it seems like, again, we sort of just shame ourselves constantly and castigate ourselves constantly for our failures or for the things that we need to fix, but we don't equally reward ourselves for the good things that exist in our culture. Things like, the healthcare system in Australia, like the rule of law, like democracy. We don't seem to appreciate them the same way that we do the inverse of appreciate all the negative things. Because you never hear people of saying, it almost feels racist now to say I'm proud to be Australian.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly where I'm going.
I'm proud to be, of Western culture, because it's like, you can't, it's almost been, you can't be that. You can't, anyone else can be proud of their culture and their government and their race or whatever, but you can't do that.
And that stifles conversation, right? And I saw examples this week where I felt like, and I can't express that. I suppose that's the point, right? I don't want to express what these other people expressed, right? But I saw people expressing particular opinions that I thought were very reasonable. Twitter folk thought differently, decided that they were going to have at it, and force these people to apologize for what they had said. But what they had said, in my view, I mean, I don't know, right? Maybe I'm totally wrong, but it just wasn't racist. Like, it just wasn't racist. It was just like, and stifling that conversation, I think. I don't know. Like,
this is where social media comes into it, though, and there being very little goodwill or good faith in arguments anymore. And it's just mob rule in terms of if we disagree with you, we'll take the worst possible interpretation of your opinion and we'll find out where you work and we'll petition for you to be fired. We'll petition for your life to be ruined. And it's kind of like this is the weird thing, the interplay of social media with the media and with these current issues in the world, because we're bombarded with it. We're in this experiment that none of us signed up to, using social media on a daily basis.
Well, you did sign up to it. You remember when you checked that checkbox?
We signed up to the social media, but not to the experiment.
Well, you kind of did, because by saying that you would participate in that, in that social network, you were essentially saying, I am okay to participate in this experiment. I don't know. I personally, I largely dislike the conversations that occur on pretty well all social media platforms, negative or positive. Hey, that's great that the occasional positive conversation occurs, but I see far too many people saying, hey, I've got a thing that I want to talk about, and it may well be controversial, but here's the thing. I don't know much about the issue. And by me reaching out and having a conversation about it, I'm asking you, the people in my social network, to educate me and to help me to form a more nuanced opinion, a more robust opinion. Instead, what happens is you're wrong. I'm posting your address on every social media platform and doxing you. And, everybody immediately jumps to the straw man. And what it means is conversations aren't had. We never move forward. And we find ourselves in the same place that we were 5 years ago, just more angry, more bitter, and not willing to participate in the conversations. Like, I don't have those conversations more on social media. I'll have the conversation with you, and I'll have the conversation with Greg, either offline or online. But I won't have those conversations on social media anymore, because it's not okay to be wrong about things on social media anymore.
Yeah.
At least that's my experience now. It is not okay to have a wrong opinion, even if you would even if you start your conversation with, "Hey, I'm probably wrong about this. Here is what I think based on the experience that I have had and what I've read or what I've seen on this topic." I'm genuinely and openly and without any sort of duplicitous nature, I am putting these words out here in order to have a genuine and open conversation.
Yeah, there's that ABC show, You Can't Say That.
Yeah,
and I think that's perfect evidence of it, right? As soon as people become anonymous, they ask questions that they would like to ask, and people brave enough to give an answer without saying, well, that's just ignorant. You're just ignorant, and closing off the conversation. Or
they tend to laugh, though, each time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, it's a bit of a shock, yeah? I mean, and ultimately...
I remember watching the one about 100-year-olds, and there was a guy on there who was probably 105, and they were like, do you get sick of this and just want to tap out? And the guy's like... the guy was like, every day. Like, I just want it to end. I just want to die, but I won't die. I'm so over it.
Yeah.
No smile. And you're just like, whoa.
It's full on. Look, I do. That's why I like that show a little bit. You can sort of get a sense of, you sort of ask a question that maybe you've been curious about, or at least, I don't know, even just watching that uncomfortableness is kind of good. Anyway, a little bit off topic. But yeah, I think that maybe those people were always going to be out there anyway, and maybe social media is a way of pushing society to a point where it had to go anyway. Like those people were out there. There's people who always had these thoughts. These people who were always angry, or people who very, very strongly wanted to I don't know, publicly humiliate other people for their past beliefs and all that sort of stuff. and this has given them that opportunity, and maybe it's something that we need to, it's like a cathartic situation or something that we're going through. And maybe one day we'll reach
it's weird though, because it's mob. It becomes mob rule very quickly, I feel like. It's sort of, I think any individual person, the same as trolls, wouldn't act that way in a face-to-face kind of interaction with the majority of people. But once you get behind I'm sure, but the average person, I think, it's funny. The other day, and we can get into this as a segue, I was on ABC.
Your segues are awful.
I'm trying to improve them. Jesus, give me a chance. So I'm on ABC Indigenous' page, and they posted something about needing to get rid of Captain Cook and Lachlan Macquarie's statues because they were incredibly racist people. And I simply said, all right, I've done a bit of reading. I have a bit of an idea about both of these guys, but I don't have the view that they are like inherently evil, racist dudes. Can you give me some examples? I would like to have an open discussion. If you could point me in the direction of, evidence where these guys were inherently, let's get to Australia and just massacre everyone because, we're so much better than everyone else. And immediately it just descended into Captain Cook was effectively Hitler of the 1700s.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people have said that.
Whoa.
Well, we will grow up, and we will grow up. My kids will grow up in a world where these deep fakes are common practice. So, where will they get their history from?
Yeah,
who will be a reliable source for history when they jump on YouTube, and they have Donald Trump saying whatever, and they have whatever, whoever saying whatever. Like it's this blurring of history is a huge issue, I think.
That's a bigger thing that goes to fake news, that goes to just narratives, echo chambers on social media and the internet, the responsibility of the media. So we're going to have some, if we're going to have social media like Facebook and Twitter have such control and the ability for their algorithms to put people into self-imposed echo chambers effectively, we're going to either have to have that explicitly stated to people. So it's like, you go in and there's a warning. You are in a right-wing echo chamber. Just be aware of that fact, or you are in a left-wing echo chamber.
Well, so, it's already getting to a point where it's a bit
anything about bananas.
It's a bit like it's getting to a point already where it's a bit like choose your own adventure, isn't it? I mean, like you get to choose how you want to view history, how you want to.
It's such a difficult thing. I get on there, people post stuff I don't agree with, and I do have this. I don't want to see that, or I just want to delete this person because I don't want to see that, and I have to remind myself, Pete. It's fine to have people with different opinions. It's good that you're being exposed to this. Don't delete that person. In fact, like the post so that you see stuff contradictory to your main narrative, to your echo chamber more often to sort of give you a shake. Yeah. But I don't think the average person does that. I think they're much more likely to be like, that's uncomfortable by, all these people saying, it's a bit of a non sequitur, but if Black Lives don't matter, delete me from your Facebook. And it's like, well, who on your Facebook really thinks Black Lives don't matter?
Yeah, but that's right. Yeah,
you mean if anyone's uncomfortable with that? But
and deleting a post and reposting a post or deleting someone doesn't prove anything.
You end up getting these two groups that just aren't communicating, right?
It removes the diversity from your And I'm not going to pretend that Facebook is filled with actual people in your actual friendship circle, but it does remove diversity from, the groups of people that at one point in your life you have considered them close enough within your friendship circle to approve them as a friend or as a follower on whatever social media platform. Because to your point, Pete. And to slightly...
Let me go back a few pages in my notes. Yeah.
to slightly contradict what I said earlier in that I no longer engage, particularly on social media. Yeah. I will absolutely be okay with having people in, people that I currently follow or people who, I've previously friended who have whatever view it happens to be, whether it contradicts my own or whatever. I'm perfectly okay with seeing that post because it is a we live in a multicultural, we live in a multicultural society. We live in a society that is filled with a diversity of opinions and a diversity of, moral worldviews and, just worldviews in general. And that's okay for other people to hold other opinions. I've met people who are, don't like vaccinating their children. I've met people who are against 5G. I've met people who believe the earth is flat. I've met plenty of these people in the real world, and I can have a genuine conversation with these people, and we can have, empathy towards each other's position and, have both an entertaining and an informative discussion about how they came to that opinion, et cetera, on social media.
And why you're never going to Byron Bay again.
Yeah, well, I might go there but I'll make sure that I'm vaccinated before I go there. But yeah, I find myself in the position where I cannot say anything against, whatever somebody has said on social media, because you immediately are smashed because you hold an opposite opinion, which is it's just so unfortunate.
Yeah, well, it is. I think
it's what it's become. I get it.
Yeah,
but
also one thing I admire about Australia as well is that we have not descended into. I mean, the divide between left and right in America is so tangible. You can basically just walk across it, right?
Well, when you see the graphs, right, of the split, it used to be they were pretty overlapping as bell curves. And nowadays, in the last, I think it's only like 20 years or something, they have significantly shifted apart, right?
There is a deep hate for the other side. There is a deep, deep hate for the other side. And that's really sad to watch. And it manifests itself, obviously, with what we're seeing over there. It's just, I'm so proud that we didn't end up like that when we were having our protests. Not that I should have ever thought that maybe it was going to, but I was a bit worried there, particularly with the fact that they were banned. Some of the protests in some of the states were banned due to coronavirus. They were, to be frank, they were banned because the people organising the protest didn't submit a proper application to have the protest, whereas the week before they had submitted a proper plan to host the protest and they were approved, which kudos to judges and kudos to the government for doing that. My opinion, this is what I'm talking about, right? My opinion was they should not have been protesting during a pandemic, right? That was my opinion, but I had to have some trust in the system when they made a decision that was against my own point of view. And
I was actually really impressed with the people who were protesting, especially in Victoria, I think. I don't know what it was like elsewhere, but in Victoria, the ones that I saw, they were actually trying to practice social distancing.
Yeah.
They were wearing masks. They were sanitizing their hands, doing everything like that to so even in a pandemic where they are protesting something that is very important, they are still, cognizant of the fact that we're,
But my question is, if 20, 30, one person died, was it worth it?
Yeah.
If you killed one person or if one of your family members got sick and died, was that worth going out to protest? And I think people actually weighed that up and decided that it was. That there was an actual, almost like a quantifiable figure that they were willing to put on it. Now we're seeing some of I think, I'm not even going to say it, but I know that there's some rise in numbers in Victoria. I don't know how much of that is linked to the protest. Probably none. Now that I've said it.
There's been 3 people that have been to the protests. I'm not sure if that's just Victoria or if that's all across Australia, but I don't think that they got them. They haven't shown that they got them at the protest.
Oh yeah, they were sort of So, but I mean, look, it was a risk, right? Yeah. It's a calculated risk. Was it worth it? And we do this all the time in society. We always calculate risk, and we always are willing to sacrifice some lives for a greater good. It's just how it goes. I mean, I heard a great example of someone who was on the drum the other week, and they talked about the risk involved in drink driving. We have a 0.05 limit. Yeah. Now that's going to cost some lives, that 0.05 limit. If it was just a blanket 0, less people would die, right?
I think the issue though is right that the people who drink drive tend to not really give a shit about the limit.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose it's just an illustrative point in the fact that they can almost quantify how many lives that's going to cost per year, yet they still allow it to happen. So it's not as if death is the ultimate moral compass by the sounds of it, right?
Like, otherwise, no one would drive though, too, right?
Yeah, well, exactly,
more
right?
Just from driving, yeah.
Yeah, so you go, okay, this is the calculated risk, and I suppose people figured that if there was a certain amount of deaths from the protests, that was worth it because we want this significant change. And if we're not going to do it now, well, then when on earth are we going to do it? Because this is the time. You know, and I know Jake and I had a bit of a joke on the podcast, on the Pouch of the Podcast, which was every Sunday.
We're gonna plug it.
Was Scott Morrison saying, look, we were creative about how we commemorated Anzac Day. Can you please be creative with how you protest Black Lives Matter? And I was like, well, what do you want them to do? Because Anzac Day is going to happen again next year. Anzac Day is going to keep happening. This conversation is a unique point in time. And what do you want them to do? Do you want them to go out and stand on their driveways? Well, that's going to get a lot of media attention, isn't it? It was novel and it was cool when we did it in solidarity as part of commemorating Anzac Day. Not novel and cool if you're actually protesting against a systemic racism or an entire police culture that you want changed. That's not going to happen. So I could, it's honestly, it's one of those things where I can just see both sides, which is the exact reason that we do the Pouch the Podcast every Sunday, because I want that opportunity to have that discussion. That's sort of how I feel like that. I sort of feel like that's my contribution, right? Because I didn't want to go out there and protest because of coronavirus, and I didn't want to not do it because of coronavirus, and I didn't want to think, well, weigh up those options. This is sort of my contribution, is the discussion, is the conversation, is a white, I don't even know if I'm middle class man going through the motions, I guess. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the podcast.
There's been a few weird things going on, right, in terms of these protests leading to, because it is, I'm trying to think of how to word this as well as I can, but the Black Lives Matter thing and the Indigenous issues here in Australia are very important issues, but then it bleeds out into let's remove statues, let's rename Victoria and Queensland, let's remove TV shows that have ever had blackface in them or have mentioned any slurs. Especially the weird thing about that one is like Netflix has removed The Mighty Boosh, Little Britain, League of Gentlemen, Bob and David, all these TV shows. I think BBC Two has done it with Fawlty Towers. And one of the episodes there where they had racial slurs in one of the skits. The weird thing is that all of those are comedy, and you could still flick on and watch something like American History X, where he stomps a black guy's head into the curb, and it's about Nazis. You can still watch Dave Chappelle doing skits with whiteface on, pretending to be a white guy, and movies like White Chicks, where there are two black guys, purposefully dressed up as white women, tricking other black guys. What is going on with that? And is it actually helping to be politically correct and for these companies like that to be as woke as possible in these sorts of times? Does that change anything, or is it just virtue signaling?
I mean, this is a personal opinion, but I don't really care what individual platforms do with stuff that is on their platform. If they feel that they don't want to, both represent and perpetuate whatever things are being espoused on those TV shows that they end up blocking or removing, that's up to them. They're private institutions. Broadly speaking, love a bit of free speech. It has its merits and it obviously has its detractions as well. At what point does free speech actually just become hate speech, etc.? There's all sorts of boundaries that exist there. But broadly speaking, I love access to a broad range of content as much as I love access to a broad range of opinions and et cetera, as we were previously discussing. I love access to a broad range of content as well, and not necessarily Chris Lilly. Not really my bag. And so if they take Chris Lilly down, I am not so affected. But I loved Faulty Towers, and that's quite unfortunate that's been loved Little Britain.
Well, I think the thing that frustrates me there, though, is the goodwill, the understanding of the fact that it is, especially in the case of comedy, it's meant to be taking the mickey out of everyone. It's not that, you should be able to give good faith to the person making the skit and say, well, they're not dressing up as a black person because they're trying to be racist, but because the act of someone not black dressing up as a black person is inherently funny and humorous, the same way that a black person dressing up as a white person is, and it's going to have a different effect on it. So I don't know.
I can't talk to that stuff, but it is always unfortunate when you block content, or access to content, because the whole, the premise that comedy is only good when you punch up is a faulty concept, right? Because there's all sorts of comedy, and we shouldn't necessarily block a type of comedy or access to a type of comedy, because instead of doing the woke thing and punching up only, it also takes a low shot. Plenty of people's comedy, I used to love going to stand-up comedy all the time. And there were plenty of occasions where you get, 3/4 or more of a set is punching up. It's all really interesting stuff, punchline after punchline, or long story with a cool punchline. And then they do one joke that's sort of a low blow, and it's meant to be sort of self-deprecating. All these, there is nuance to comedy. If that one little bit of comedy is determined to be punching down, so to speak, punching down, which is a concept that you may want to describe at another time on Aussie English. But, it is punching down, and that 1 second punching down happens to offend one person, and that one person, decides that, that whole show should be cancelled. That's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. I don't know that it's exactly the same as, but, it's one of those things. I love the music of Michael Jackson.
Yep.
He's been accused of a whole bunch of stuff, and, was never found guilty, but settled a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of cases. Still love the music of Michael Jackson, regardless of the fact that he had done that, had been accused of that. Should I disregard that all that music, all that body of work, the breadth of work, because he allegedly did some stuff? I don't know. Sorry.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I could unpack that a lot. I think a quote that I read the other day, I think sums up this conversation quite nicely. It says that, and I'm butchering it for sure, but it was something along the lines of, if yesterday's actions are to be judged by the standards of tomorrow, then how should I behave today?
You were boned. We're in trouble.
What?
It's such a good point. It's such a good point. It's, it is, and this is potentially a thing with statues. Can we judge the character of people living 200 years ago who did certain things?
I think the thing with the statues, though, is that I think people would be, where they're positioned is particularly symbolic, and it suggests something about where we would like our history and our culture to come from. I don't think anyone would be against the idea of them being put in a museum. So it's not the statue, right? Mm-hmm. It's the symbolic nature of where they're positioned.
Reverence.
Now, yeah, that's right. It's designed so that you are, you are forced to confront those particular parts of history, but we deliberately leave out other parts of history there. Now, you put them in a museum, you see them in a totally different light. It's the same sort of thing as when when that guy who put the hat rack at the door of the art museum. It becomes a hat rack. You put the hat rack on a piece of string and you tie it to the roof at the doorway to the art museum, and it's a piece of art, right? So where it's positioned is very important, and I think that's probably the point. My feeling about statues is similar to the feeling that I had when Triple J decided to move the Hottest 100 from Australia Day. I was like, good, just stop it from being political, get it done, get it over and done with.
Stop the Triple J 100.
No, the Triple J 100 is great. I know it's fun to bag on Triple J, but anyway, they're great. And it's the world's largest music poll, so majority wins. I think that ultimately, I was just like, just do it, get it done, because it's about the music. And I feel like that about the statues as well, right? The music, I suppose, in this metaphor is our Indigenous culture and our Indigenous history, right? Get rid of those statues from where they are, put them in a museum, because we don't want to deny that history. But what you think at some point we're all going to be comfortable with these statues? You think at some point we're all going to be comfortable with the date of Australia Day? I just don't think this. My
argument would be
this is not an argument that you win.
My argument would be raise other statues. Put ones up next to them. Put a disclaimer on the statue if you want. I don't know how much hiding them away, because if they go to a museum, really, they're just going to go out the back. No one's ever going to hear from them again, really. They're not going to make a display for the statues, right? I think they're just going to disappear. So I would say instead, let's look to Indigenous heroes and famous Indigenous people and make statues. Put them up, as many of them as there are statues of other people. But the thing that worries me about the statue thing is that it seems to be a broader symbol of we need to forget about this. We need not to worship any of these people who can be interpreted in any way, shape or form as being less woke than we are today. And we need to forget about them, never talk about that issue again. It needs to be gone unless it's in a certain light that we're okay with. And that makes me uncomfortable. I'm like, the very fact that we had things like slavery in the past, I don't want to forget about it because it was so bad. It freaks me out that, people want to remove certain bad characters and forget who they are and throw them into rivers or whatever. And it's like, we don't have to worship them, but let's remember what they did, who they were, the ramifications of that, and appreciate that and move on from that, right? Because if you get rid of history, you're kind of doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I do know, and I totally agree with you. I suppose from my point of view, it's more about it's really just about going. There is a fracture between certain aspects of Indigenous culture in Australia and non-Indigenous culture in Australia. There is a complete fracture. If you are born in Indigenous Australian, chances are you're not going to have as good as time as a non-Indigenous Australian, right? And I think if I've got my statistics correct, it actually goes for immigrants and all that sort of stuff. Well, they tend to fare better than Indigenous Australians, right? In a lot of regards when it comes to healthcare and all that sort of stuff. Now that fracture, we sort of are getting a message about how part of that fracture can be healed. So why not give that a go? Because the stats and stuff on the gap, what is it called?
The gap.
Closing the gap aren't all that spectacular of a year. So why not give this a go, and why not do that community service that we talked about before, with the police?
It's an interesting
community thing.
It's an interesting point. And I would love to know more about how much of that has to do with the fact that Indigenous communities tend to be so much more isolated from large cities and from suburbia.
Well, all of that would be a factor, right? All of that is a factor. But what's easier, getting rid of some statues or picking up a town and putting it near the ocean?
I would say just ignore the ignore the statues.
They're your options, Pete.
Ignore the statues and put all your attention to closing the gap.
Okay, I don't know. I suppose, look, if all the people overseas, like where did those statues get pulled down? In the UK and in America and stuff like that, they pulled them down. Is it really that big of a deal? It's just a statue. I don't know. Go and name like 4 famous statues in Australia.
I think it's one of those things where it's not really about the statues, right? It's more the attitude and what that means.
But who's pulling them down or who's defacing them? Like in one case that we were discussing on the pouch, it was a Greens MP. So a Greens MP who was alleged to have done it.
Yeah.
A woke individual who's decided to take a particular political position and, essentially be a social justice warrior for a group who, don't necessarily. I mean, my great issue with these conversations here are we find ourselves both asking the question of how to fix things and answering those questions of how to fix things when we find ourselves like there was the Uluru Statement of the Heart that was signed by I think 50,000 odd Indigenous Australians, and it was taken to Parliament. It included a voice to Parliament. The whole premise of that was giving Indigenous Australians a say in how they live their lives and how laws that are going to affect them and their communities, et cetera, are enacted. Now, a voice to Parliament, it might end up just being a consultatory body, as every single special interest group has a consultatory body, all right, that exists today, right now, in federal, state, council, parliament, etc. And we're talking about one extra one specifically for Indigenous Australians. That's what they've asked for, but yet we keep asking ourselves these questions of how can we, improve the Closing the Gap report, and then proceeding to try and answer that question. I'm not saying that that's what any of us tonight were trying to do. I'm suggesting that in general, that's what we find our communities, that's what we find ourselves trying to do, is to answer these questions related to, the questions we raised related to the Closing the Gap report, when the questions and the answers really belong with, and they have been asking for so long, with Indigenous Australians. They want to have autonomy over their lives. And, then they're not, in the Constitution as First People in Australia, whereas every other colonised Indigenous group around the world has, they are in the Constitution of that country. New Zealand, there is I forget the name. There is a treaty in New Zealand between the Indigenous New Zealanders and the colonists. In North America, in Canada, in the USA, in Brazil, like Brazil, which is a ridiculously conservative and has been for a long time government. They've got anyway. My point is, we keep trying to answer these questions that we raise ourselves when the who are affected most by these issues and by these questions, asking for their autonomy. That's all they want, and we it seems we refuse to allow it.
Is Jake's internet kicking out for you as well?
A little bit of glitchiness, but that's all right. It wasn't so bad. We couldn't get the gist of what you were saying. I think it just maybe took some effort there. Are you streaming the podcast live, Jake, on Facebook? Are you?
It must be. Am I back normally now?
Somewhat.
We can't see the books in your library, so there's a little bit.
Out. Yeah. It does look a little bit better, to be honest with you.
Okay.
We've had technical hiccup after technical. I think my camera went black before because my camera ran out of battery because I bought one unthinkingly. It doesn't allow external power.
To sort of finish up,
it's a metaphor.
We've been smashing it out a bit. Can I ask you two sort of questions? Can tribalism based on skin color ever be outgrown, do you think?
I don't have an answer for that. I don't even know what any of
that is an
means.
answer, right?
I've got to write them down. Hang on. Can what?
Tell you what I can do
Tribalism.
is I can answer from the premise of someone who did an anthropology degree, that in-group, out-group is the way that humans have survived.
Yeah.
Homo sapiens, I asked today, we evolved by excluding others. We survived by excluding others, by creating our own communities, sometimes sharing between them, sometimes not, sometimes warring between neighbours, sometimes not. Sometimes, immigrating or moving in order to get away from conflict, sometimes just moving in order to find a new patch of food. We've been doing this in-group, out-group tribalism stuff for tens of thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years, for millions of years. We don't have an understanding of what Australopithecus afarensis were doing in terms of how they started their communities, but based on how chimpanzees act, we can expect that it's probably not too dissimilar from a community in-group, out-group type of setup to what we live with today.
Yes, I agree.
That's
or not,
thing.
depending on who's listening.
I think the biggest thing there is that we need to recognize the fact that it's inbuilt, it's ingrained, but by recognizing it, we can kind of fight against those urges. And I think we need to push further towards that and realize, that we do have in-group preference built into us, and we need to recognize that and fight against it as a result, right?
That would absolutely be my argument of, this is probably the first opportunity that we have ever had in the history of our, us, to properly examine, it's the first time that we've had the spare time, the free hands to examine our own motives and to examine the world that we want to live in. We're not foraging for food for 70% of the time that we are awake in a day or in a night. We have the time and the opportunity. We are exposed to vastly more than any other culture in previous generations would have been. I couldn't agree with you more, Pete. It's both our opportunity and our obligation, I think, to examine our biases, whatever they happen to be, and to do our best to override them as we encounter them.
Greg?
I'll leave that one for Jake.
You just
summed it up poetically.
All right. For you then, what's the role that media plays in all of this? What responsibility do they have?
Yeah, look, the media thing is really weird for me at the moment because there's like podcasts and all that sort of stuff are huge, right? And I would like to be a part of that sort of culture. And part of the reason that I want to be part of that culture is because I want to create something. And I think about, gosh, what's something regular that I can create, right? Now, I've thought to myself, I can create something where where Jake and I can comment on the news articles that are coming out. Now, I then worry about people maybe listening to the podcast and that's where they're getting their news from. And I'm like, well, that's not right. Like, these people who sort of, and I'm very much guilty of it, getting my news from people like Stephen Colbert or Seth Meyers or a few other people that I listen to on YouTube, other people, and I'm not, like how often do you engage with a genuine news source or even watching The Drum? It's just people's opinions, like what about these journalists who are losing their jobs all the time? Like where are we going to get this really solid, unbiased news if everyone's sort of moving to these commentary style things? So after I'd finished my little existential crisis, I was thinking about that very question around what role do they then play? And unfortunately, I think they have a really hard sell ahead of them because the internet has unfortunately shown that a majority of people really like watching cat videos and they really like watching people, do speed, what do you call them? Like speedy shots of them renovating a caravan or something like that pops up on Facebook for some strange reason.
Not Speed the drug.
Not Speed. Speed. Like a time lapse. They do like a time lapse of them renovating a caravan or whatever it is. Yeah. Like people like to watch those sorts of things. Who's engaging with genuine news sources and what about the journalists who are genuinely, trying to keep their jobs by doing that sort of news?
Well, the problem, to interrupt you there, the problem there is too that we realize now that humans are so much more prone to reacting to outrage than they are to happiness, right? So the news seems to have taken a turn it doesn't seem to be unbiased in terms of the coverage that it gives all
No,
possible stories that are
yeah.
out there. It goes for the ones that are going to get you outraged as much as possible.
And I suppose I had two revelations over the last week while I've been pondering on this. I tend to have a theme in my head that I'm pondering on. This happens to be the one for this week. One of them was that was the acceptance that the news sources that I thought were unbiased maybe aren't unbiased, and that news sources and commentary and all that sort of stuff has a bent. It just does. Like, it has a way of presenting information for a particular reason, for a particular purpose. And so whether it's Sky News or whether it's ABC News or something like that, going into it thinking, okay, they actually have a motive and they actually have a bias with what's going on, has changed the way I sort of look at it a bit. And on that point, I was thinking, that's cool. Like, Jake and I run this politics podcast, and then something popped up on my feed or on Reddit or something, right? And it was the whole recording of Question Time. And I thought to myself, bugger ever watching the whole thing of Question Time, right? Now, then I thought to myself, actually, you know what? I don't actually get into politics. I can't say that I am into politics, right? I can say that I'm interested in the drama of politics. What Jake and I discuss during the week is the drama of politics, the events that it's condensed down. And what is the surface level stuff that happened? Oh, this person said something mean about someone else this week. Oh, blah 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 blah. But we don't sit there talking about policy. We don't sit there talking about the nuanced parts of our constitution or whatever it is. We don't sit there talking about the processes that are followed. I mean, to me, that would be politics, right? What we're doing is commenting on the playing of politics. What we're doing is just trying to have a bit of lighthearted fun with what would otherwise be particularly serious. I don't know. Jake's gone.
That's it. He's gone.
I didn't want him anyway. He's bailed. I finally found an opinion that annoyed Jake so much that he had to leave.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page as you. We can probably wrap it up there, man. We've been racking on for 2 hours now.
We have.
I think this is going to be an episode without a transcript.
Absolutely. Look, whatever you decide to do, I don't know. Look, you've got some comments here, Pete. Before you go, you've received some comments. You've got Koyoka Kennedy said, I've had enough of the incidents, but it's happening in many parts of the world. Paramishwa said, "G'day, Pete. How's it going? Great to see you with your mates."
Sorry, I'm trying to open up the comments. I got
Ben
them here.
said, "I like Aussie accent, hey, and hearing natural accent helped me learn better. Hey, this is lovely. It's lovely.
Good on you
You've
guys.
changed
Glad
the world.
to have you out here.
Even if we get annihilated for some of the opinions we've expressed, I think we've changed a few worlds."
To finish up, maybe we can talk a little bit about that quickly. It is so frustrating that so many people seem to.
Sorry, but I'm just imagining Jake just being so angry right now.
About what?
Just that his Skype has dropped out there. I just imagined him. I'm glad you got a background, because I can imagine that maybe you were throwing a chair at the wall or something like that.
No. I put something in the chat. Pete saw it.
Yeah, he had to wait.
Oh, did you? Oh,
he didn't bail. He went to the loo. That's why I was like, his Skype didn't break. What are you talking about?
Okay. Oh, right. I'm not looking at the chat. I'm focused on the conveation.
No,
All right.
everything was reasonable.
Last little bit. I'm just peeing myself, Jake. I'm a professional. I've got all sorts of things going on down here.
The thing that frustrates me the most about all of this is just how much you have to monitor what you say openly, because you now have to worry about the worst way possible anything you say could ever be taken. And the fact that, especially for us, but anyone now on social media, it's effectively there for life if you put it out there, and you will be held to that account in the future. So that's the thing that sort of frustrates me, that we've kind of lost this benefit of the doubt, right, for a lot of people. It's just, we will interpret whatever you say in the worst possible way that we can imagine, and we'll hold you to it. So and the thing that frustrates me about that is that you see a lot of disingenuous bad actors towing the line and virtue signaling and doing all the right things through fear, not because it's necessarily something they want, but it's more begging for their lives, right? Just don't come after me. I'm a famous person who's got a lot of wealth, not me personally, but imagine, white person in Hollywood, millionaire, actor. Of course, all the things they're going to say are going to be so woke because they're going to be like, please just don't come for me. Don't come for me. And that's the thing that sort of makes me feel uncomfortable about the current state of things.
That's you,
I think
Jake.
we live in an interesting time, and I don't know how to go too much deeper into that than just saying that. It is unfortunate that you can say one thing today and that can get you into trouble 6 years down the track. But I feel that the vast majority, and maybe this is an incorrect opinion, so I'll just state it as an opinion. It's unfortunate.
Someone told you. You got to say someone. I heard someone. I heard a commentator.
I've been reading in the media recently.
That's right.
I've seen recently statements about the number of people who are found to have done something in the past. Those things that they've done in the past are reprehensible in the past as well as at the time which they are discovered. So for those people, I have nothing to say about that. But for people who are being judged against different standards, the goalposts have moved. I don't know how many cases of that there are, but it is unfortunate. There are probably opinions that I've held on the iFriends in I was doing it for virtually or essentially 10 years. So there are probably opinions that I held on year one when I was super atheist and super anti-theist that I not only would disassociate myself from now, but would probably consider to be reasonably reprehensible as a human being trying to navigate the world. So I would probably find myself disagreeing a tremendous amount with myself from 10 years ago. So
that's where that's so dishonest, though, right? Not as in what you've had to say, but the fact that someone would go back to what you said 10 years in the past and pull that up as if that is who you are currently. The same. I think it was Kevin Hart made a gay joke or something on Twitter and ended up being fired from hosting the Oscars because it was made and it was like 14 years ago when he was 20 something, and you just like. Joe Rogan talks about this a lot on his podcast. We need to work out a road to redemption too, for where people do make mistakes, because we're all imperfect. We all make mistakes, and we all should reserve the right to change our opinions and have shitty opinions that get improved. But it seems like we're witch hunting, right? It's like if we can find anything that we can see that is not okay with what we believe, that's it for life for you. You're done, and there's no path back. You're screwed. You've sinned. You go into hell. There's no way that you could ever come back. And the problem is we need to come up with some sort of way that with social media, with the media, allows people to genuinely come back to have respect from their fellow humans.
All this goes back to my statement earlier that I feel as though on social media you're not allowed to be wrong anymore. I feel to some extent this extends to platforms like podcasting and similar, particularly the historical version of it, because in the same way that iFriends exists today, the recordings that we made on day one in somebody's apartment 10 years ago, they still exist today, and could be played again, and et cetera, et cetera. And in the same way, I may have posted something on Facebook 10 years ago, and I probably don't agree with that either. But the fact is, I'm more than happy to say I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And it's just
because you are all the time.
No, exactly.
The theme of the podcast.
Exactly. That's the best.
The name of the podcast. I'm wrong.
Yeah.
It's not a bad one. But it's good to be wrong, because out of that wrongitude you learn.
Yeah.
You grow, you develop, and so does the frickin' society. Does society want to have all of the same people all of the time who have only the opinions that they were born with? Well, no, because the opinions that they were born with were boogers taste good and my diaper's full. So,
my diaper's full, Jake. I didn't turn off my Skype.
I know what you've been doing under the desk, Greg. Yeah. No, it's okay to be wrong, and we should be okay with, wrong opinions, old opinions, being.
I've gone fuzzy. I'm trying to get my autofocus to kick in.
Hurry up.
Sorry.
See me.
You keep talking, Jake. Just pretend like I'm not here.
It's just
I'm a fuzz.
I'm
just a fuzz. Trying to get it to work.
It's done wonders for your wrinkles.
Shine a light on it.
It's like the Bold and Beautiful, how they slightly take the camera out of focus and everyone all of a sudden looks beautiful.
I'll just lean forward to when I am in focus. How's that?
Good enough.
It's gone onto my laptop. There it is. I got it. Don't move.
I'm glad that we were all involved in that.
Yeah, it had to be, because otherwise it was just going to look like a twit.
Yeah, look.
You were saying?
To your original statement / question, your comment / suggestion or whatever it was, it is unfortunate, and I agree with you that there should be a road back, unless Joe Rogan said it, in which case I disagree.
No worries. So shall we end there? Have you got anything you want to add, Gregory?
Years ago, and I don't want anything to do with him ever again. No, I'm just kidding.
What about you, Greg?
I've gone fuzzy again. I don't really. I love that idea of having a road back to redemption. I don't know what that looks like. I think
compassion.
You've got to take
people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, you've got to take some credit for it too. I mean, you go into Twitter, you go into Facebook, knowing what sort of world we live in at the moment, and so you've got to take some credit for your actions as well. You got to take some ownership over your actions, and you've got to own those opinions that you've had, and you've got to own them. And if you need to apologize, well, I don't know, maybe you do need to apologize. Maybe you did cause offense. I think an offense is another topic altogether. But lately I've been thinking about offenses as I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not such a bad thing to be offended, and also maybe it's not such a bad thing to honor someone else's offense, because it's a very peaceful way to have a discussion about something rather than making people angry. Anyway,
it's such a good. On a side note, I have to build a fence tomorrow.
Do you?
There's a comedian.
The autofocus.
Do you know his joke of like what happens with being offended, right? He's like, nothing happens, right? It's not like you wake up one day and you've got leprosy.
No, but I also don't. I suppose to dismiss offense altogether might not be a productive thing either. To go, Diddums, you were offended. There might actually be some deeper meaning behind offense sometimes. And maybe it's like a signal that we're about to get into territory or do something that's not great. And so maybe we can hang on to those little bits of offense and not make fun of people who are offended, but use them as little markers or a flag point for where we're about to head in a conversation or where we're about to head as a society. I just don't, but on the flip side of that, if you decide that you're going to take action and ban shows or something because you were offended, well then, you've opened up the discussion to a different realm, I think.
Well, the weird thing is where people preemptively get offended for other people, right?
Yes.
So like with I would love to know with Netflix and a lot of these shows that they've removed, was that a preemptive thing, or was that you had a lot of complaints? Or BBC, were there people watching Faulty Towers, going through it and looking for a reason to have it removed? Or did you just preemptively do that on behalf of anyone who could possibly be offended?
And that's where I was going with my point before about the media, right? Like in the sense that I wasn't too surprised about that, because I went, Netflix has a political bent. Netflix has one of the changing points for me was when I learnt that boards of newspapers, and I'm talking about the Times here in the US, that the Times board themselves voted that they were pro-impeachment for Donald Trump. Now that meant, I didn't really know what that meant. I sort of thought in my head, that means that they will print stuff or look for things that will support impeachment. And they were quite open about this. It wasn't hidden or anything like that. I suppose I just need more information about what that exactly meant. So Does Netflix have a board? And the board went, you know what? We are offended by this. And you know what? You're a customer. You're paying for this. You're not paying for and corporations are considered people. I don't know if they are in Australia, but certainly in America they are. And so they have they have opinions. They have a bent, right? And what you thought Netflix was completely secular in this regard? Well, no, and neither's the BBC.
I've got no issue with that. I think, but be open with it, like with Google and Facebook. You know how and Twitter with censoring.
Well, I think they're pretty open with it. They banned it.
but at the same time, they kind of try and cover it up, and no, we're all about free speech and everything like that, except for these people we don't like. You know, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you're the CEO of a company, your job is to make money for your stakeholders. It's not to make the world a better place. It's to make I'm pretty sure it's very much against the law for them to do anything other than to try and make money for their stakeholders. Like you can't. That's your job as a CEO. It really came to a head for me when I was on the Apple Music app, and they'd turn the Apple Music app black for a day, and you couldn't access particular menus, and they said that the show must stop as opposed to the show must go on. You know, for one day the show must stop, and I was like, I just want to play a playlist, you know. And that was then one of those. It was one of those moments where I realized what I thought that Apple that they were immune, they were secular in this regard.
The thing that makes me uncomfortable though about when they get into that area, it's kind of like, I hope they're doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the thing they think will make them more money.
But what about column A and column B? Why not both?
Yeah.
Why not believe that, yes, we believe it's the right thing, and if we actually voice this opinion, we will also make a bucket ton of money.
It could be. And I hope that would be the correct case, as opposed to, well, who gives a shit what the case is? Just do this because it'll make us money. And that's what I would be like, ooh, I hope that's not the case.
But I wouldn't be surprised if that was. I mean, that's what they are. They make money. That's Apple's job. Just make money.
Situations, though, you would hope, and really this goes, Greg, to your point around the board of that the Times. You would hope that they have a diversity of opinions. You know, that you would hope that they have a diversity of expertise as well. And it's important when you are facing a particular issue that you show solidarity with a cause that you politically align with, or that the board feels that the company should politically align with, and B, that you be seen to make that action that aligns you with that political cause that your company feels that it should align to. I'm not saying one way or the other that it's a bad thing, but it's the reality.
I don't know. One of those things with Apple, though, for example, is they would do something like that about Black Lives Matter whilst using forced labor in China to make iPhones.
Yeah.
You know, so it's I don't know how you can do it with a straight face. Yeah.
They want to make money, right? And the onus is on you. The onus is on you, not on them. The onus is on you. If you know they used Chinese labor, don't buy their products then. You know, don't do it. Yeah. If you're against forced labor, if you're against cheap labor, don't buy cheap products. Don't do it. Don't own a computer. Don't own an electronic piece of equipment. You know, and maybe it's not that simple. I mean, maybe it's not that simple, right? Maybe you go, okay, maybe owning an electronic piece of equipment is actually not a choice anymore, really. I mean, you've got to own it, right?
Especially with the podcast.
And so, they do have I agree that they have a responsibility to society and to fix things. But really, I mean, you know, they're out to make money. That's what they do. You know, it's a machine that makes money, that lives past their CEO. The CEO dies and this machine that makes money lives on. You know, I like to think too that
next CEO.
It's going to be the case with Aussie English, I tell you what.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's the thing, right? That's the thing with Apple. I think that, you know, a lot of people think that I like to think anyway that, you know, they do these things because they're morally just and because, you know, like they have a lot of safety, they have a lot of security and safety on their features, on their products, because they really believe in security and they really believe in keeping your stuff private. But that makes them money. So I don't know.
Selling point. That's right. Yeah, I mean, companies have this thing called corporate social responsibility, which is essentially, particularly at large corporations, it is an arm of that corporation that is tasked with improving the perception of that organisation in the communities where they sell their stuff or market their stuff or have their stuff.
Yeah.
Big telcos. Apple might be a good example. They may in fact have really cheap child labor in China, or have such poor working conditions. The workers are taking their own lives, as has been documented a bunch of times. But in a country where they sell the product, they might be doing some really great things. And they refer to that thing as corporate social responsibility, where they they are doing good stuff for the communities in which they sell the product or market the product. So that's great. But the whole purpose of that is to improve the perception of the company, not necessarily to do good. But it is a dichotomy. It is column A. They are doing good in that community, but they are, in column B, also improving the perception of the company. I don't know. Not a bad thing, but the fact is it exists. It happens. Everyone, large corporations, they do it all the time. It's the reality of stuff.
Well, I'd hate to be the one editing this podcast.
Am I glitching again?
No.
The length. He's talking about the length.
Oh, shoot.
This is going to be an episode without a transcript.
I would just go to the 1 hour mark, slice it, put it up as 2.
That's probably about when Jake's internet conked out as well, I think.
Yeah. That was really fun, Pete. That was really great.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. And I don't know who had who on, but thanks for catching up and chatting about these issues. And I'm glad that if the ship goes down, we're all on it, and it's not just me.
And on that beautiful note, that's all I got. It's your podcast, Pete. You got to do a little wrap up.
All right, guys. Thanks for joining us. Keep it real and keep dialogue open. Keep chatting. It's all about the dialectic. It's
and
all
check
about
out
discourse.
the Pouch the podcast for less serious commentary than what you just heard for the last 2 hours.
Significantly less.
It's awesome. Where we make branch stacking jokes and other relevant jokes that aren't very deep.
See you guys. All right, I'm going to hit stop here.
I'm ending.